Good morning. I'm Heather, and I'm the Kids Ministry Director here at Doxa. And today we're going to be reading from Ephesians 6, 1 through 9. Too bad we didn't leave the kids in here. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service, as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will, as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality in him. You may be seated.
Well, hey, if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and turn to Ephesians chapter 6. We are in the very last chapter of this study through Ephesians. And man, it has been good. And as you're turning there, whenever we were first looking at planting a church here in Tucson, my wife and I, our family, still lived around the Houston area at the time. And we started feeling God calling us towards church planting back in the summer of 2019, okay? Fall 2020, we took our very first trip to come to Tucson to see if this really is where God's leading us. And man, we were excited to check this place out. We've been reading about it for a long time. We've been seeing pictures, all these different kind of things. And the anticipation was building up, and we could not be more excited to finally land here and get a sense of the city and figure out if this is where God's leading us or not. And as we're packing, as we're getting everything ready, we're making sure my mom was going to come in town to watch the kids while we were away. Just going to be us driving around the city, praying, all these different things. We take our kids to school, drop them off, say goodbye, tell my mom bye, go to the airport, fly, land in Tucson. As soon as we land in Tucson, I get a phone call from my mom that says, "Hey, where are the car keys?" And the reason why she asked that question was because she needed to pick up 4 kids from preschool, daycare, and elementary school. And our car was one that had all the car seats in it and was the only car big enough to really carry all these kids back home. And the keys to that car were in my wife's purse in Tucson, Arizona, hundreds of miles away. And we got that phone call and we're like, oh my gosh. We were so focused on getting everything else packed and ready, nowhere on our to-do list was leave the keys, and those keys just ended up by kind of this default habit in the purse in Tucson, Arizona. And so the first thing that we did when we got off that plane was find the closest FedEx to the airport to overnight our keys to my mom so she could actually take our kids places. And it was a hectic time. And luckily, my mom drove in, had her own car, and she told our kids, when they sat down, they were like, "You buckle and you don't move, because there's no car seat." And so they were just like this the whole time. It's like, "All right, we're doing what you say, Nanny. We're not going anywhere," right? And luckily, she got the keys, and everything was fine. But here's what we learned in that moment, right? Is that as we were getting everything prepared, everything ready to go, as everything was getting knocked off the checklist one by one, little by little, over and over and over again, here's what we discovered. We discovered that when you forget one key ingredient, in this case an actual key, or a key detail, all of this planning can easily come crumbling down, right? That once that one key thing is missing from this, everything else begins to break, right? All these plans. And I tell you that because today What Paul's going to do, who's the author of Ephesians, what he's going to do is as he continues to write this letter, he's going to talk about these other different kind of relationships that we have. And as he talks about these relationships, he's going to say there's a key ingredient that leads to the flourishing of humanity inside of these relationships. And that key ingredient might seem small, might seem insignificant. It's a small thing, but yet it is huge. And when it's removed, everything begins to break down. And what he says that key thing is, he says it is honor. That as we revere, respect, and show honor to one another, that it leads to this kind of flourishing. And even in our society today, that when that piece gets removed from it, man, things feel a lot more broken. And in our society today, I think we even feel that to a degree, right? Where we have different people talking about different things, arguing about two different sides, and it's not so much the disagreement as to why things maybe feel as tight and as with all the tension that we feel. It's not so much that there is disagreement, it's more so that there's dishonor in the midst of the disagreement, right? And when that key component starts to get removed, man, everything begins to kind of break down. And what Paul's going to tell us today is he's going to say, hey, in these relationships, there's this key thing that when it's there, it helps lead to flourishing. And that key thing is this idea of honor. And the way that Paul's going to do this is he's going to talk about two different types of people. He's going to talk about children and their parents. And then he's going to shift. He's also going to talk about this other relationship between two different kinds of people, these bondservants and masters. Now, real quick, we need to address that word before we dive any farther, okay? Because here's what has happened over the course of Christian history, is that some people see verses like this in the Bible, and they see that word bondservant, which is also a Greek word that can easily get translated to the English word slave, okay? That's a very uncomfortable word for us, right? And they see that, and they see how Paul begins to address masters in this text, and they look at it and they say, hey, Paul doesn't tell them to free their people, and so therefore the Bible must, for some reason, be condoning slavery. And so before we get into anything, let me just unpack this so that we're on the same page here. Nowhere in the Bible does the Bible condone that kind of act whatsoever, okay? And even in this text right here, okay, we need to understand that reality. That Paul does not tell masters to free their bondservants, but the reason why is not because he's condoning it. The reason why is for a few reasons. One of those reasons that slavery in this time is completely different than what we think of when we think of slavery, okay? For starters, it had nothing to do with the color of anyone's skin. That was not a factor at all. Ethnicity, race had nothing to do with it. Not only that, but here's a really important side note on this, is that when someone was a slave, they could easily become free. There was a governmental system to where anyone can earn their kind of freedom and escape that, okay? And oftentimes what you would find is that people would actually put themselves into slavery. They would go what they would call under contract with someone. And they would do this to themselves. Their own freedom, they would do that. And the reason why they would do that is because, for starters, maybe they had some debt they needed to pay off. And they would say, hey, I'm going to go under contract to this person. I'm going to work for them for X amount of years. They're going to go ahead and pay off my debt. They're going to provide me housing, clothing, food, shelter, all that kind of stuff for me and my family. And I'm going to work for them for a season as they pay off this debt of mine. And then when that season is over, now I'm a free person. Right? Another reason why some people would put themselves under contract or into this kind of slavery is because they weren't Roman citizens. And as soon as somebody was under contract, they become a Roman citizen. There's a lot of benefits to becoming a citizen of Rome and the Roman Empire. And so they would put themselves under contract in that way and work for someone for a season of time, and they would come out a full-fledged Roman citizen. And so what you would find is that people that are in this stage, oftentimes what you would have also is that they would put themselves under contract because they wanted to learn from somebody. So there might be a physician out there that was a really good physician, and they wanted to learn from them, and they would put themselves in this position so they might learn from them. And so what you would have throughout society, you would have people that were in the positions of being technically slaves, but they were all across the socioeconomic ladder. You have some people that were high in governmental authorities that were technically slaves to somebody else. Some people that were physicians, philosophers, scholars, teachers, you name it. They were all over the map. And so when this is referring to these kind of bondservants and this kind of slavery, we have to know it is nothing like the kind of slavery that we have in our mind that poisoned this country. It is not like that at all. Not only that, but when we look at 1 and 2 Corinthians, what Paul will tell people is that, hey, if you can earn your freedom, earn it because you are a slave to no one. Your ultimate master is Christ and Christ alone, okay? And so what we see here is not the Bible condoning slavery at all, okay? It never in here at all actually puts that forward, okay? What he's going to do is he's going to talk about how do we live in these kind of relationships for the glory of God and for the flourishing of society. At the same time, what we've seen throughout our history is that passages like this have been used to justify slavery while at the same time being used as the bedrock to emancipate slaves at the same time. There have been people that have taken the Bible and has twisted its meaning and twisted its interpretation to justify something like this. And at the same time, what we've seen is that when the Bible is used properly, that the bedrock of the emancipation and bringing freedom to people in our country was this fact right here. Every single person is made in the image of God, and therefore they have dignity, value, and worth, and should not belong to anybody else. And that was the bedrock truth that led to the freedom of slaves in this country. And so here's what that means. That means you can take the Bible and you can twist it to justify whatever crazy, sinful act that you want to justify. At the same time, you can use it in the way it's designed, which is for the flourishing of humanity, which is why at Doxa we have a deep, deep, deep conviction to preach the Bible, what we call expositorily, which means that we walk through the Bible book by book, verse by verse, little by little, to open it up and for us together to see what God has to say in his own words. Not trying to twist anything, not trying to get an agenda across, but just to open it up. That doesn't mean that every now and then we're not going to jump into a topical series. We will every now and then, but our default bent is to open up the Bible and walk through it line by line, verse by verse, so that we can see what it says for it our good and for the flourishing of our city, for the glory of God. Okay? That is our conviction as a church. Okay? Now, that's a side note. All that just to kind of get that stuff out of the way so we're on the same page when we go through this text together, all right? So that being said, again, what Paul's going to do, all right, this is the main topic, right, is he's going to talk about this honor between parents and children as well as this kind of employer-employee relationship. And the argument he's going to make is that when you take this out, man, it begins to break things down. The way that God has created humanity to flourish, that there's this key ingredient called honor, that when it's in place, it leads to the flourishing of humanity and the glory of God. And that's what we're going to see. Let's jump in. Verse 1, all right? Here's what it says. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Last week, as Paul begins to turn this letter, he begins to start talking about relationships between people. And says, how do we function as Christians in this world, in these relationships with different people? And he started last week by talking about husbands and wives, and now he turns the corner and starts talking about children and parents. And the command that he gives to children is really twofold. He says, obey your parents, for this is right. And then he says, honor your father and mother. That's where you start, okay? That's the only command that he gives them. Now, this command to obey and to honor is nothing new in the Bible. This is not Paul being like, hey, I got an idea. What if we just had kids honor their parents? Maybe that would work well for them. No, that's not his idea. This has been around throughout the Bible forever, right? Most famously, probably, when we think about this command, is in the Ten Commandments. Whenever Moses is on the top of Mount Sinai visiting with God, what ends up happening is as God's relaying these commands, relaying part of this law, he starts by giving him 10 commands. The way the commands are structured is right in the middle. Number 5 of 10 is this command right here, to honor your father and mother. And what's interesting is that whenever you begin to look at the structure of how the 10 commandments are set up, the first 4 commands are all about how we relate to God. The first one is that we should have no other gods before him. Number 2 is that we should not make idols for ourselves and bow down to them. Number 3 is that we should not take the Lord's name in vain, but honor and worship him for who he is. Number 4, that we should remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy so we might rest in the goodness of God. It's all about our relationship with God. And then he pivots, and then commands 5 through 10 are all about how we relate to other people. And the very first one, right out of the gate, is honor your parents, which is really interesting, especially when you consider what comes right after. Because the 6th command is don't murder. Then you have don't steal, don't commit adultery, all these other things that in our world are like criminal acts that can lead you to be like punished by the law, right? You could go to jail for these things, but right in the middle of all of that is, hey, honor your parents, right? which feels kind of odd that this command is taken that seriously, that in the same breath that God says, honor your father and mother, he immediately says, hey, yeah, don't kill anybody, It feels kind of out of place. But all throughout the Bible, what we see that the scriptures tend to take this incredibly seriously, far more seriously than we tend to take it in our day. We can see in Deuteronomy, it says that anyone who dishonors his father and mother should be cursed. That's wild. Like parents, can you imagine like telling your kids, like, hey, you better straighten up, I'm going to curse you, right? Like that's nuts. Look at 2 Timothy. Paul's writing another letter to his protege Timothy, and he's talking about the end times. And here's what he says. For chapter 3 of 2 Timothy, he says, but understand this, in the last days there will come times of difficulty. He's going to explain. Okay, this is what it's going to look like. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving God, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Then he says, avoid all these people. This long list of all these negative things coming out of Paul. And right in the middle of it, man, you know what they're going to do? They're going to be disobedient to their parents. Can you believe that? That's insane. But all throughout the Bible, it puts this kind of weight and emphasis on this command. And whenever we see this, I think, man, like for me, the big question is why? Because in my world today, that's not the thing that has the most emphasis on it. Right? Like we live in a world where kids are disobedient kind of constantly. I'm never calling the cops. And so why is this command have all this kind of weight on it? The reason why is because this command is the first command with a promise. And that's what Paul points out. You see, Paul's going to quote the command from the book of Exodus when God gives it in the 10 Commandments to Moses. And then he's going to make a little bit of a note. He can say, this is the first command with a promise. And then he's going to tell us what the promise actually is. Look at the text again. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. That's the quote from Exodus. Then Paul says, this is the first commandment with a promise. What's the promise? Here it is, verse 3. That it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. That's the promise. The reason why the Bible takes this so seriously and significantly is because when we follow it, it goes well with us and it helps us live long in the land. What on earth does that mean, right? Well, the first thing it means is that it is good for us, that there's benefit to us, that it is for our good and for our flourishing. And the reason why, again, is because God has created the world not out of random, but God created the world orderly. That he created it in a way for humanity to flourish. And that whenever we live and operate inside the parameters in which God created, it ends up leading to our flourishing. And so what that means is there's not a principle in the entire Bible that if you don't bring into your life and start following that you won't benefit from. You will benefit from every single one of them. Why? Because God created the world to flourish in a certain way. And so he tells us, this will go well for you. And what I think was happening in our society today and in our culture, I think that a lot of this is really kind of becoming even more and more true. That what we've done as a culture and as a society is we've said, hey, maybe God's ways really aren't the best ways. And so we started to create some ways for ourselves. And the secular society is trying to pull us into those kind of things. And as we do, I think what's happening is that a lot of people are realizing, hey, this doesn't really work. It's not leading me to flourishing. And what you see a lot of times, you're seeing people really begin to question some of those kind of narratives, and they're starting to find guidance and truth in the lens of Scripture, and they start applying this to their life, like, oh my gosh, this is benefiting me. Like it's leading to my flourishing. And the reason why is because God has created a structure, and whenever we exist and operate inside that structure, it leads for our good. It is for our good. It's interesting. The University of Alberta, several years ago, did a study for over 15 years where they just surveyed a bunch of different families and different things like that to see how people develop inside of homes. And here's what they saw. What they found was that as children become adults, that when those children have a strong bond between their parents, right? But when they were adolescents, they have a strong bond with their parents. Here's what it leads to as an adult. It leads to higher self-esteem, lower depression, and more healthy romantic relationships in their life. In other words, it is good for them to have this kind of relationship and this kind of bond with their parents. It is for their good. God's commands never restrict us from joy. It is aimed to maximize our joy. That's what it says. So why is this so important? The reason why is because it is for your good. that it will go well with you. And the second reason he gives is this, that you may live long in the land. That may live long in the land originally is in reference to the promised land that God was giving the nation of Israel. And what would happen is God made them a promise, and he said, hey, as long as you continue to follow me, you will live long, you will prosper in this land that I'm giving you. But as you turn from me and begin to worship other idols and chase after other things, what's going to happen is if you continue to do so, I'm going to raise up other nations, and they're going to bring you out of that land and into exile. So if you want to stay long in the land, man, continue to worship after me, one generation to the next generation. Tell them about my good works and my good deeds so that you would continue to chase after me, and you'll live long in the land. And that's an Old Testament perspective, but Paul quotes it here, which means that there still has relevance for us today. And so how is it applicable for us today? Well, here's what Paul is telling us. He's saying, hey, when you follow this way, what it is good for the land. It's good for society. It's good for the people around you. And the reason why, and we saw this a little bit last week, is that the family unit is the bedrock, it's the foundation of the culture of society. In other words, that how the family goes, so goes the culture. The direction of the household leads the direction of the culture. I love the way that John Ruskin, who was an English historian in the 1800s, wrote it. He says this, he says, the history of the rise and fall of the great civilizations of this world is not its record of its wars, but a history of its households. Why does he say that? He says that because he recognizes something. That the way the home goes, the way society follows. You want to change culture? You want to change society? It starts in the home. It starts with this. And so here's what Paul is telling us. He's saying, hey, when kids follow their parents in this way, when they honor their parents in this way, it goes well for them and it goes well for society. It is for the good of them and it is for the good of the community at the exact same time. That's what it is. That's why it's so important. Now, here's the thing. Here's the reality, right? The reality is that no one does this naturally, right? Kids don't get born with this kind of sense of like, I'm going to just honor my parents, right? We don't see that. We see the exact opposite of that. And the reason why is because sin enters in the world and it curves love inward. Augustine, who was a 4th century theologian, defined sin as incurvatus in se, which is Latin for life lived inward. That my love is aimed at me. And so what we find is that when kids when they're incredibly little, they are all me-centered. Everything is about them. Which is why we typically refer to 2-year-olds as terrible twos, because they constantly throw tantrums because you tell them no about things, right? And all they want is what they want for themselves. I remember one time when our kids were in our home back in Texas, got home from work, heard screaming and crying inside the house, right? Walking up to the front door, that's all I heard. And it was one of those moments where me as a parent was like, I have a choice to make here. I can either get back in my car, no one knows I'm home, and just wander the grocery aisle for like an hour, and maybe come in when it's clear, or I could just walk in, right? And so I walk in, and our 2-year-old at the time is laying down in the entryway, screaming as loud as possible. And I look at my wife, and I'm like, is there a demon in this child? Like, do we need to lay hands on her? Like, what is going on right now? And she's like, she's 2, she's throwing a tantrum, just ignore it. And I was like, okay. And I remember I literally stepped over her and was like, I need to get around you and go to where I need to go. I might even just kind of shove her to the side. But that's the picture we get, right? We're not born into this world thinking, how can I honor the people around me? That's not, everything is me-centered. Which means that if children are going to follow this command to honor their parents, they have to be taught to do so. And the people that God gives them in their life to teach them to follow the commands of God, to obey and honor their parents, are the parents themselves. Which is why Paul says in verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The primary responsibility when it comes to bringing up children in the household falls on the parents themselves. I know that Paul refers to only fathers in this passage, but he's referring to fathers as the head of the home. It is parents together that bring their children up in this way. They have the primary responsibility to bring them up in this way, which means parents in the room, you cannot delegate this to anyone else. This is not the primary responsibility of the school, not the primary responsibility of someone else in your family. It's not the primary responsibility of the church. The church has a role to play in this, to resource you, to equip you, to help you, to come alongside you, right? But the primary responsibility when it comes to raising up these kids in the instruction of the Lord falls on the parents. That's the person, those are the people that God has given children for their good. Okay? So how do we do this? Well, Paul tells us. He tells us first what not to do. He says, do not provoke them to anger. That's where he starts, which feels like an odd place to start. Like, just don't make them mad, right? Like, okay. What does he mean by that? Well, that word anger in the Greek is, the root word for that word is also the word wrath, okay? It's not just don't make your child not happy for a moment. That's not it, okay? It's not do everything you can to please your child. That's not it, okay? Sometimes your kid's going to be disappointed because just you're the parent and you got to step in charge, right? So it's not that. It's this idea of wrath. That's got like this vengeance, almost this kind of hatred concept to it. And the reason why he says it like this is because here's what happens. When someone becomes so angry towards someone in this kind of way, this kind of wrathful vengeance kind of way, it creates a numbness in their heart to where they don't want to listen to any word coming out of your mouth. And if you are the primary person that God has given that child to raise them up and to instruct them, that means that they need to listen to you. And if they are filled with wrath and vengeance and anger, they're not going to do it. My wife and I right now, we're watching this TV show on Apple TV. And one of the episodes, the main character, this female, gets reconnected with her dad. We don't really see her dad like halfway through the show, finally gets reconnected. We learn that there's just some of this baggage that happened in the past. And as they connect, this primary character needs help from her dad, and she's asking for help. And then he is trying to give her some life advice to see how she's doing. And immediately in that moment, she's like, I don't want to hear anything from you except how to help me. That's all she wants. Don't try to check in on me. Don't try to say that you love me. You've never loved me. All these kind of things aimed at him in this moment. Why? Because there was this wrath and anger and hatred built up in her heart over time to where it created this numbness to where no matter what he said to her, she did not want to hear it at all. And so Paul warns us. He says, be careful how you raise them. Because you can raise them in a way where they become so wrathful, they become so angry, so hatred towards you, where they don't listen to the instruction that God's given you to give to them. Which means that parents, right out of the gate, what it means for us, that we are to model the kind of love, the kind of patience, the kind of grace, the kind of honor that we want from our kids. We model it first and foremost to them in order to prevent this so that they can hear the instruction that we have for them. Now, you might be someone in the room right now. Maybe when you describe this kind of anger, this numbness towards someone else, maybe that's a relationship that you have with someone already. And we're going to get to in a minute, how do we honor people like that? Honor people that we don't feel like are actually honorable. But for now, what Paul tells us, he says, parents, you need to be careful in how you treat them and what you say to them, how you bring them up, because you can easily lead them to this kind of place where their heart is so filled with anger that it weighs them down and it makes them numb to any kind of instruction you have for them. And so avoid it. At the same time, here's what he says. He also says to use discipline and to use instruction. Those two words together means to correct and to train. That when they do something wrong, that you correct them on the right path. So what that means is it means that when we are trying to be gentle with our kids, it doesn't mean that we just let them do whatever they want. There's still correction. There's still discipline. There's still instruction. We're training them up in the Lord. At the same time, we're doing so in a way where we love them, respect them, honor them. So that as they grow up, they don't have a single doubt in their mind how much we deeply love and care about them while we guide and instruct them along the way. Man, for me, I have been blessed to have two amazing parents who have guided me in this way. I remember when I was a kid, junior high, every now and then my dad would just invite me and my brother just to come sit in the living room just to talk about the Bible. Like something was just on his heart. He'd say, hey, I just want to share these things with you so that you can see for yourself just the goodness of God. I would not be who I am today, leading a church like I am today, if it wasn't for the amazing influence my dad had on my life. Without a question, him and my mom are the primary disciple makers in my life. At the same time, my dad was very good at correcting me. Remember one time when I first got my license, I got a new car. Not a new car. I got a 1980s El Camino. That was my very first car. It was awesome, okay? Don't judge me. It was incredible. I love this car. It stuck out like a sore thumb. Everybody knew that's Chris's car. And one of the rules when I got my license was whenever you get somewhere, Chris, you have to call home. And in the words of my mom, so that we don't know you're in a ditch somewhere. Direct quote from my mom, okay? And in my mind, I was like, why don't I call you if I am in a ditch? That would just save some cell service time, right? You're paying for the bill, so maybe I'm just trying to save you money. And let me tell you, I was terrible at following this rule. Absolutely terrible, okay? I never did it. And one time, I went to one of my friend's house and got there, didn't call my parents. We were there for several hours, and I left my friend's house, and I went to where I thought I parked my car, and I could not find it at all. Not there at all. And I'm like, oh my gosh, did it roll away? Like, it's an old car. Maybe the brakes just like gave out and just rolled down a hill. Like, I don't know. Where is this thing? And I call my dad. I'm like, Dad, I can't find the car. And it's not like I mixed it up with someone else's. It's a 1980s El Camino, okay? No one else, believe it or not, in my friend group had that car, okay? And I could not find this thing. And I call my dad. And I'm like, Dad, I don't know where it is, man. And all he said on the other end of the line was, just get home. We'll talk about it later. Click. And I was like, oh my gosh. Like, I'm dead. Like, I told my friend who's going to drive me home that day, I was like, why don't you just take me to your house? I'll just seek refuge in the arms of your family. Because I'm not going to make it. We pull into my neighborhood, and sitting in my parents' driveway is my car. My parents stole my car. They got the extra keys. They were tired of me not calling them. They drove to my friend's house where I was a mile away, stole my car from my friend's driveway without anyone noticing until I got home. And they were like, are you going to call us from now on? And I was like, yes, I know how far you will go. Point proven, right? But man, they did a phenomenal job of painting this picture of guiding me, training me, bringing consequences when there needed to be, discipline when there needed to be. At the same time, there was never a doubt in my mind that they love me. Never a doubt. And that's the picture that he paints. Don't provoke them to anger. Love them. Be gentle with them. Be patient with them. They're going to drive you crazy sometimes. Be patient with them. Love them. At the same time, be firm. Guide them, instruct them, lead them towards the Lord. And as we lead them towards the Lord, as we lead them to honor their parents, it leads them to honor the one true Father over all things. And as that begins to happen, it then begins to bleed out into society, which is what Paul says next. Verse 5. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, that he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality in him. What Paul does is he starts with the family. He starts with parents and children. And then as children begin to learn to honor their parents, what happens is it begins to bleed out, and now they begin to honor people on all other levels of society. And notice the language that Paul uses is the same kind of language used between parents and children. This language of obedience and honor. And that as we honor our parents, it leads us to honor other authority figures in our lives. And as we do that, here's what happens. It brings glory to God, and it blesses the land. It blesses our land. It is good for our land. And the reason why is because as he begins to paint this picture of honoring other authority figures, he gives us a picture of how to do that. He says, honor them as you would Christ. Meaning it's the same kind of honor that you give to Christ. That's the motivation. The motivation of honoring these people is not that they are honorable. The motivation for honoring them is that you have honored the Father in heaven, the perfect Father in heaven. That's the reason. Which means that showing honor to those in authority over us is not something that is based on their character, but something that is based on ours as the people of God. The reason why we choose to honor others is because we recognize that God in his sovereignty has placed those people over our life. And so as we honor them, we are honoring the sovereignty of God who's placed them over us, regardless of their character. Romans chapter 13 says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. He's placed them there. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who will resist will incur judgment. The reason why we honor authority figures in our life is because God in his sovereignty has placed them there. So when we honor them, we are honoring God's sovereignty over us in this. And when that happens, it brings glory to God, and that begins to trickle out into our world, and it changes our society, and it blesses our land. The reason why we show honor to people that God has given the authority over us is not because they are honorable and deserve it. The reason why is because when we submit to God himself and we honor him above all things, one of the ways that we honor him is by honoring the authority figures that he sovereignly places in our lives. And I know that when I say that there's some of us in the room that's like, man, Chris, that's a really hard thing for me. Because you don't know my dad, and you don't know my mom, or you don't know my boss, or you don't know my professor, or you don't know fill in the blank. Like, I'm glad, Chris, that you had a great dad. I'm glad that you had a great mom, but that's not my story. And in my mind, they're not the most honorable people in the world. And yet, this is what God invites us into. That the way that we honor them, even though they're not honorable, might reveal the glory of God to them. And perhaps even lead them to faith in Christ themselves. So how do we do this? Well, Paul tells us to do it with a sincere heart, meaning it's not fake. That out of genuine sincerity that we honor these people. So what does that look like for us? Let me say this. Maybe 4 quick things, then we'll end. First one is this: be quick to forgive. Some of us, there's been a lot of pain by a parent or an authority figure who used their authority in our life, not for our flourishing and for our good, but to maybe get some of their will across, something like that. And there's some pain that maybe you've been holding on to. Maybe your heart is so angry with these people that you've become numb to them. That you've been tempted time and time again just to delete them from your phone. To pretend as if they're just dead to you. And your heart has become completely numb to them. The first step in this is just to proceed with forgiveness. And that's not a thing that you do once and you're like, okay, great, I'm done. That's a thing that you come to day after day after day, forgiving whatever pain they may have caused in your life. And as you forgive, here's a really important thing you need to know. Forgiveness does not equate to trust. There might be some brokenness in that relationship. And oftentimes what we can think of is, for me to forgive means I need to draw near to them, or we need to be buddy-buddy again, and that is not the case. Forgiveness is freely given. Christ freely forgave us every sin. But trust is something that's earned. And so you can honor someone by forgiving them, and then also use wisdom and discernment to keep your distance from them. Because there's still pain that you're afraid might come back into the situation. So you might need to use wisdom there. But the first step is this: honor them in a way by forgiving them. And that, for you, is more for your heart than it is for theirs. They may not receive it, but there's a weight of anger hanging around your heart right now. And the first thing you do is just cut the string and let it go by just forgiving them for what they've done. That's the first one. The second one is this: pray for them. Pray for their good. Man, when you begin to pray for these kind of people in your life, it releases a lot of that kind of strain. That kind of weight that's been holding you down becomes a lot lighter. Why? Because you're praying for their good. You're like, God, I pray that you bless them. Lead them, God. Convict them. Draw them close to you. Pray for their good. The third thing is this: talk well of them. Don't go behind their back and complain about them. Don't find a friend to vent to them about. Venting, all it does is we think that we're going to vent and everything's going to get out and I'll be fine. It's going to cool me down. That never happens well. What venting does is it fuels the flame. It just makes us more angry, more upset. Our heart gets harder and harder and harder towards these different people. It fuels that flame. So talk well of them. If you need an outlet to maybe get some things off your chest, here's what I would recommend. I would recommend journaling. There's a lot of times early in the morning where I'm just weighed down by anxiety and worry, and I just pull out a pen and just write to God. Here's all the things. First Peter will tell us that God wants our worry. He wants our anxiety because he cares for us. Don't bring it to somebody else. Bring it to God. He can do something about it. And the last thing is this. We want to honor them. Then we have to learn to honor the perfect Father in heaven. You may not have that father figure in your life. Man, I'm sorry about that. I hate that for you. But what can lead us to honor those in our lives in this way is that when we honor God above everything else. And the reason why we can honor him above all things is what we see from him is that he is deeply, deeply, deeply loves us. And whatever void in your life that maybe a parent or another authority figure has left, here's the beautiful reality. God can fill it up completely. And what we see in the heart of God is this deep love that he has for us. Because what he did was he sent his son to die on the cross for you and me so that we can have the abundance of life in him. And so honor him. Come to the Father. Pour out your heart of praise for him. Let him lead you and guide you. Let the overflow of your love for him be directed to the people around you. God calls us to honor those around us. That as we do, it leads to flourishing. Let me pray.